Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed last week's video lecture. I was not able to be there in person because I was doing state exams and can only be in one place at once. But they are there for posterity for you to look at whenever you like. And this one will be as well, because like last time, we will be recorded by the Kim streaming service, and this lecture will be available after a short while on the streaming server. So here's a little bit of Old English. You saw some last time, but just to give you the flavor of it, it sounds more or less like this. Nu we zullen herjan van riches werd. Met horas nichte an die moordethonk. Weok wilde vader, zwa he wonderig was, eetje drichten ord onstelde, he ares je shop, erden bernum, he wat de grove, hali schippend, tha middenjaard, monkunes werd, eetje drichten, efter theode, firmfoldan, freya almichtig. And it gives you a bit of the flavor of Old English, hopefully. And one thing that you will no doubt have taken away from this is that it's really not all that clear what any of it actually means unless you've studied some Old English. Really, when you look at Old English, it's a little bit like learning another foreign language. Nevertheless, like any language, Old English has patterns, it has rules, it does make sense when you look at it for long enough. And as a result, that is one of the things that we will be doing now. So in the tutorial, you will be getting a chance to look at the Old English texts and to actually try and decipher this material. You can think of it a bit like an applied cryptography class, trying to make sense of this apparent nonsense. A useful skill because you will be faced with apparent nonsense at many times in your life, and you will often have to decipher it in some way. The tutorial dates and times are here on the slide. Hopefully no one should need reminding at this point, but there they are in case anyone needs them, and that will give you the skills you need not only to understand the system in an abstract sense, but also to be able to work with it yourself. We're going to be dealing with Old English in two halves. Today, we will be talking about the sources for Old English, for what kind of texts we have. We will be talking about the sounds of Old English. So what does it sound like? Why does it sound the way that it does? And how does that differ from what we see in the present-day language? We'll also be dealing with some of the morphology of Old English, because as we've touched on before, Old English is a synthetic language. It's a language where a lot of the important information in terms of function, in terms of semantics, is conveyed by meaning of inflections, word endings in particular. So we'll be dealing with the nominal morphology today, and then next week we will come back to deal with the verbal morphology and the syntax, and also the lexicon, the vocabulary of Old English. So what have we done previously? Here's a little reminder. In the first half of the 5th century, according to Bede, a bunch of Germanic-speaking peoples, the Angles, the Saxons, the Frisians and the Jutes, according to Bede, come to England and settle there. And this is basically the start of Old English as we know it. This is the first time that there is a Germanic language stably spoken in the British Isles. And this is where ultimately modern English begins, just over 1.5 millennia ago. Now, the very oldest Old English, as you saw in the writing system section of last week's lecture, was written in runes. And the Old English runic alphabet itself was a little bit different from the traditional Elder Futhark runic alphabet. This one is called the Futhorc, and it has a few differences here and there, but we're not going to dwell on that today. And if you want to find out more about the runic inscriptions from late antiquity in England, you can have a look at the book by Page from 1999. Okay, any questions or comments before we go on? All right, so we're now going to talk about what sources we have for the study of Old English. How do we know anything about this language at all? That should be the crucial question that should be the first to your mind. This is a language spoken 1.5 millennia ago to some extent. How can we know anything about it? And how has it survived? How has it been passed down to us? We can more or less divide up the period, the Old English period, into two. The early Old English period before 900 and the late Old English period after 900. What we actually find is that for the first 300 years, 350 years of the history of English, we have very, very little material. We have a few isolated bits and bobs here and there, but we don't have very much that tells us anything about the birth of English as a language, about its emergence in the very earliest times. Our real texts start to emerge in the 9th century, and particularly with King Alfred of Wessex. Alfred the Great, as he's known. He will come up again. Alfred's a very important figure in the history of English because one of the things that he did two things that were important. One was he was on the throne of Wessex, which was the southernmost of the Old English kingdoms at the time when there were invasions, raids from Scandinavia, settlements from Scandinavia in the eastern part of the country, and he was the one who dealt with that situation on the Anglo-Saxon side, sometimes through winning battles, sometimes through losing battles, sometimes through paying the Vikings lots of money so that they would go away. And all of those strategies worked to some extent, but there was still a massive Scandinavian influence in English, and that is something we will be discussing in 2 weeks' time. The other thing that Alfred did that was incredibly important for our purposes is that Alfred was someone who was very, very keen that the English people should write in their own language. Prior to this, there was lots and lots of stuff in Latin, and Alfred was largely the person who said, "We're English, we want to write in English." And he did that for obvious reasons in a way, because Alfred also was trying to establish England, a kingdom of England, that wasn't just the individual kingdoms of the Heptarchy, but was rather its own overarching entity for all of England. And obviously developing or cultivating a national language was something that was quite important for him for the purposes of fostering that kind of national unity. So it's in many ways really not surprising that it was Alfred who decided to kick this process off. And it's him that we've got to thank for the fact that we have so much Old English, because we have about 3 million words of Old English, and this compares very well to other early Germanic languages. We've got way more Old English than we have, for instance, Old High German, Old Saxon, Gothic. And as regards the Scandinavian languages, we really hardly have anything at all, at least as far as prose texts are concerned, from the first millennium AD. So the fact that we have so much Old English recorded is largely due to Alfred's court and their efforts to popularize English as a written medium. So that's the early Old English period. Alfred dies in 899. Another figure, Abbot Alfrich, of Ingham, who lived at the end of the 10th century, beginning of the 11th century, is the main literary figure associated with late Old English. Alfrich wrote a lot of things. He wrote a lot of saints' lives, which were a kind of popular literature of the period, and he, probably more than anyone else, is responsible for the kind of picture of Old English grammar that you see in textbooks, simply because he was such a prolific writer. So what do we have in Old English? Well, first of all, these texts that came down to us survived in manuscript form. The manuscripts are very, very often not the original, they're just a copy. Someone has copied an older text that hasn't survived. The manuscripts are written on a substance called vellum, which is a kind of thin leather, a very expensive substance, And these manuscripts were typically in the possession of wealthy people, or more usually institutions at this period, institutions like the royal court and the church. Typically, we're talking about specific types of books, like Bibles, school books. There are also some musical works in this period as well. So we have, for instance, some of the major works that it's worth being aware of from the Old English period. We've got Beowulf. In terms of Old English literature, this is the one document that gets mentioned more than any other. It's a great story. If you want to read the whole thing, you'll probably save a lot of time if you read it in its modern English translation, because it is difficult even by Old English standards, and we won't be touching on it in this course. Beowulf is written in a mixed dialect. The manuscript is from around the turn of the millennium, but the text is usually thought to be much, much earlier. There is some scholarly debate about this, but the usual take on the Beowulf manuscript is that the manuscript is much, much later, and the text itself, the text that was composed sometime at least 200 years earlier, because it reflects an earlier stage of the language. We've also got the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Lindisfarne Gospels you can see here on this slide. This is one of the beautiful illuminated pages, folios from this manuscript. If you look at the writing at the top, above the illuminated part, you can see some red writing in this kind of boxy script. That is Latin. And then there is also some smaller, scribblier brown writing, and that is Old English. So someone has gone through this manuscript and written in Old English equivalents to the Latin words in between the lines. So this is what's called an interlinear gloss. Interlinear because it's between the lines. So each word is translated separately. For instance, the first word there we've got incipit, begins, and that's translated with Old English onyineth, again, begins. This text is particularly nice simply because of how beautiful the manuscript is. It also tells us about the Northumbrian dialect of Old English, which is not all that well attested otherwise. This is one very famous manuscript, one very famous text from the Old English period. We've got several other manuscripts, particularly the Junius manuscript and the Exeter book. These are manuscripts which contain substantial poetry records. We also have quite a lot of Old English poetry. We've got a poetic version of Genesis and Exodus. We've got a poem called Christ and Satan. We've got early poetry such as Wolf and Edwater, and there are also riddles. And this poetic material, for a long time, all of the poetry other than Beowulf remained relatively understudied. Now people are picking up on this poetry and finding new things to say about it. There's some actually very interesting work there, again, which you need Old English to be able to access. The riddles are great fun. If you want to try and solve some Old English riddles, that is also something that you can do. And then there's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And this is a history text written by monks that narrates many of the happenings of the Old English period. And there are many, many versions of this text. Here you can see in the middle one manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This is the C manuscript. This text has survived in many different versions, and what's interesting here is that the different versions don't always agree with one another. So there were different copies of the same text made in different scribal centres, different monasteries, and they have different language, different properties. Some of these manuscripts are fairly pedestrian. They look quite boring. Some of them are beautifully illuminated. Some of them have wonderful illustrations, as well as the text. So the Junius manuscript here we've got an image to go along with the Old English text. So those are the sources. As regards the spelling, Old English, at least in the vast majority of its occurrences, uses a modified version of the Roman alphabet. So writing was largely the province of the church in the Anglo-Saxon period. It was brought by churchmen, it was done by churchmen, also church women, though you tend to hear less about them. And basically, this is an alphabet that was devised for the writing of Latin, and it was modified slightly for use in writing Old English, because Old English and Latin have different sounds, and so you need a few tweaks in order to represent Old English properly in the Latin alphabet. Here you can see a few of these tweaks. So as a note, the type of script that you find in these texts is called the insular minuscule. And it was invented actually in Ireland, where there was an earlier, very, very robust tradition of Christianity and Christian writing. This insular minuscule script contains many special symbols that you will see in Old English texts. And all of the special symbols are given here on your slides. So the first one, the one you will see the most, it looks like an A and an E that have been squished together. It is an A and an E that have been squished together, and it represents the sound A, a slightly fronter, higher version of a basic low A. So this is the ash sound. It's called ash. It is a ligated digraph, that's the official term, and it's used for a sound that Old English has, Latin doesn't. There's another symbol, in fact two symbols are used to represent roughly the same thing. These symbols are called thorn and eth. You can see them on the slide too. Now your thorn looks like it can't decide whether to be a P or a B, right? It's like it's got an upper bit and a lower bit. It's called a thorn, like the little bit of a plant that can prick you. And this thorn is something that comes from the runic alphabet. It comes from the Futhark, and before that the Futhark. So this again, it stands. What does it stand for? It stands for a fricative. It stands for an interdental fricative, th or the. It doesn't matter which it stands for, because as we'll see in Old English times, there was no phonemic distinction between these sounds. There wasn't a phonemic distinction between voiced and voiceless fricatives in Old English, at least not according to standard accounts. The symbol called eth is the same thing. This looks like a curly D with a bar through the top. Again, that's basically what it is. It's a Latin character from the Latin alphabet that's been slightly modified, and again it stands in for exactly the same sound. Voiceless or voiced, th or the, interdental fricative. You also see in Old English manuscripts a character called yog, and yog, mostly we won't see very much of yog or the next one, win, in our edited texts, because mostly the editors change it to something else. So yog gets turned into a G with a dot on the top of it, or just a normal G, and win tends to just get turned into a W, because yog mostly represents a y, sometimes a g or a r, and win just represents a w sound, a glide, a liquid. Not a liquid. So you've got yog and win there, two extra symbols. There are also two different ways of writing and. So here you've got this little triangle and. Sometimes it looks a bit like a 7. This is called a Tironian and it just means and. It stands in, it's not an alphabetic symbol, it stands in for an entire word. If you remember last time we talked about logographic writing systems, this is actually a logogram here. It's a logograph. It stands for the word and. And similarly, the ampersand, which you see today as well, you occasionally will see this in Old English texts, again meaning and. It stands for a whole word. So that's the Old English spelling system. As I've said, some of these symbols come from the runic alphabet. Some of them just derive from modified versions of Latin symbols. So the thorn and the win, these are symbols that come from the runic Futhark alphabet. They're borrowed directly from the earlier runic alphabet to represent sounds that Latin did not have. The other symbols go back to other versions of Latin text. So the yog, for instance, is simply the way a G was written in this particular type of script. So it's really just a weird G. When we get to Middle English, yog behaves a bit differently, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. As for ash and eth, these both develop from an A and an E written together, this ligature, and a D with a bar across it. Eth is not found in the very earliest texts, but we do find it later. And we find a lot of variation between texts as to whether they use eth or thorn to represent this interdental fricative. They're not always consistent, and some texts prefer one, other texts prefer another. Remember that we're dealing with a language stage here that is not standardized. There is no standard spelling of Old English. At least it doesn't really make sense to think of a standard Old English in the same way as it does to think of a standard modern English. Okay, are there any comments or questions at this stage? Yes. So the question is about texts like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which were copied in different monasteries differently. Yes. So these texts, actually, some of them contain completely different passages, completely different events. So it's not just the individual letters or the individual words that are changed. Sometimes whole sections are missing or whole sections are added in. And obviously it seems to reflect the fact that in every place where they were making a version of the Chronicle, the local people had different concerns. So the chronicles in the north and east of England were much, much more concerned with the Viking invasions than the ones in the south and west on the whole. Though again, it varies. You get, in particular, some of the later Wessex texts, so from Alfred's, from the time of King Alfred, they focus also very heavily on the Vikings because the Vikings were really the sort of the prototypical enemy for the Anglo-Saxons. They wanted to set them up as the bad guys who were coming in from elsewhere. Much like in modern American politics, you see Muslims being used in this role. They're these scary bad guys who don't believe the same thing as us, and the Vikings played that role for the Anglo-Saxons. So yeah, there were big differences between these versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. That's a good question. Any other questions? If not, then we will go on to talk about sounds in Old English and sound change. We've already hinted at this a little bit, but we will go a bit further into what's going on here. So this slide has everything you really need to know about the sound system of Old English on it. The thing at the top, this trapezoid shape thing, this shows the vowels. This kind of diagram represents the mouth. So if you think of this as the mouth, sounds at the top of this trapezium are high vowels like I, U, U, and sounds at the bottom are low vowels like ah. And not all sounds, and for each of these vowels that you can see, there is both a short version and a long version. So vowels can be, there's a length distinction in Old English, and the length distinction is phonemic, which means that it makes meaning differences. There are minimal pairs. If you take, for instance, the word God, that means God, and God is good, the word good. So God and good, just as in modern English, are a minimal pair. But whereas in modern English, the vowels are different in quality, it's an O versus an U, in Old English, it's a difference in length. So you've got an O versus an O. So these length differences are important in the phonology of Old English. There are also some diphthongs, which I haven't shown you in any of the diagrams. Those are pronounced yo, io, and ye. And basically, they just work like any diphthong does. They are a single sound with a change in quality in the middle of the sound. And again, you get short diphthongs and you get long diphthongs. For every vowel in Old English, including the diphthongs and the monophthongs, there is a long version and there is a short version. The bottom of the page here has a table with the consonants on it, and probably these consonants will not surprise you hugely much. These are, on the whole, fairly similar to the consonants that we see in modern English. The real way in which Old English sounds differ from modern English sounds is particularly in the vowels. So the vowel differences can be very, very striking, as you probably heard when I was reading the text out earlier on. The other point that should be made here is that not all sounds occur in all positions. Here, in this column, we've got the fricatives, and the fricatives are only voiced when they are between voiced sounds in a word. So you will only find a v, for instance, as the voiced pronunciation of a f between two other sounds. So, for instance, between two vowels. In the word hävon, for instance, that came up earlier on. It's written with an F, but the F is pronounced as a V because that is the voiced allophone of the fricative phoneme. And that voiced allophone shows up between voiced sounds. Elsewhere, you get a voiceless allophone. So, for instance, word initially, or adjacent to another voiceless consonant, you get the voiceless version, you get f. So that's the one big consonantal difference between Old English and modern English. In Old English, the fricatives did not have a phonemic voicing distinction. There's three particular sound changes in the Old English period that are going to be relevant to us, and these are palatalization, breaking, and vowel fronting. There are all kinds of other bits and pieces. So, for instance, there are instances of deletion. There are instances of what's called metathesis. Metathesis is when two sounds swap places in a word. So a horse, the modern English word horse, comes from the Old English word Ross, which is related to the German word Ross. So it's just that the German word has lost the H, and the English word has had the O and the R swap places. So Ross becomes horse in the history of English. Similarly, we've got this word waps, and this ps becomes a sp. It becomes wasp, as in the little buzzing insect that stings you. You also, as time goes on, get things like deletion and insertion, but like I say, we won't dwell on those here. The ones that you really need to know about are these main three: palatalization, breaking, and vowel fronting. And coincidentally, I have a slide on each of those three. So, palatalization. This is a process that involves certain sounds moving towards the front of the mouth. So palatalization is named after the palate, the Gaumen, and it basically, this process involves a sound like a velar sound, a k or a g, becoming fronted, becoming produced further forward in the mouth. The tongue rolls forward to produce these sounds. So sk turns into a sh, k turns into a ch, and g turns into a y. And this happens in a very particular environment, which is when they are followed by a front vowel or a y, a front glide, or after them at the very end of a word. So, for instance, we have the word ship in modern English. We have that in Old English too. It's written as SC. SC in Old English is pronounced sh. And this ship word comes from an earlier Germanic word, skip, which is still the word that we see in the Scandinavian languages. It's not the word that we see in German, because German has also done something similar. It's turned skiff into schiff. This word, to look for what it must have looked like in Proto-Germanic, we look at Scandinavian, and that's where we get skip. Similarly, the k becomes what in modern English we would write as a TCH, ch. That's an affricate, ch. As in words like ditch, which is more or less the same in Old English as it is in modern English, it's just written differently. This, again, is cognate with the Dutch word dike, which is borrowed into English as dike as well. The k is retained from Proto-Germanic in Dutch, but not in the English word ditch. This sound change. Remember that I said last time, sound changes only happen at a particular time in a particular place. So this sound change that changed sk into sh happened specifically in the Old English period. It didn't affect Middle English or early modern English. And that's why, when we later see new words appearing in the English language which have a sk, they're not affected. So, for instance, the word skirt. The word skirt is a borrowing from Scandinavian, and it was borrowed after the sound change of palatalization. So the word skirt isn't affected by this palatalization change. Similarly, the word egg. So the word egg, in Old English, via palatalization, it becomes a bit like German I. Then that word ends up being lost in the Middle English period and replaced by the Scandinavian word egg with a g. So those later words are not affected by palatalization because palatalization stops happening after the Old English period. As I said, palatalization is actually something that is a very common sound change. We see it in various different languages. We also see it happening in German. So all of the German words like Schule, Schiff, etc., they all come from an original sk, and that sk turned into a sh. The conditions on this change are slightly different. It's worth noting that West Saxon Old English does have palatalization. You just can't quite see it in its spelling. So if you look, for instance, look at the words like Old English ship, it's written SC, but it's not pronounced as a sk, it's pronounced as a sh. Similarly, the Old English word ditch is written DIC, but it's pronounced ditch, not dick. Okay? Similarly, Old English yelwe is pronounced yelwe and not gelwe. Right. And this incidentally shows, if you think about this, you can again see that the English word yellow, the modern English word yellow, which comes from Old English yelwe, is actually related to the German word gelb, because it would have earlier been gelbe with a g before palatalization. So you can see, hopefully, the link there between the words. Okay, the second of the three sound changes that we need to cover is breaking. And in breaking, what happens is that front vowels, so these are the vowels I, E, and A, these become diphthongs before certain consonants. So this is perhaps what gives Old English its most distinctive flavour, one of the things that enables you to recognise a text that's specifically written in Old English. It's that it includes a lot of these diphthongs that we actually don't see in present-day English. A lot of these processes were actually undone by later sound changes in the history of English. In the certain context, which is before L or R, followed by a consonant, so in the word self, for instance, in Old English, this becomes seolf. The E becomes eo. And we see another example of that below. Werk becomes weork. I'm exaggerating the pronunciation a bit just to give you an idea. These are diphthongs in the middle of the words. Seolf, weork. And similarly, the ash sound, a, becomes an in words like old. So this would have started out as alt, a bit like German alt, and it becomes ealt. And half starts out as half, and it becomes health. So you get these diphthongs emerging in the context of these L and R sounds. And it's called breaking because it looks like what's happening is that a single vowel is splitting in two. It's breaking apart. And that's why it has this name, breaking. Now, we see breaking in the text. It's represented in the spelling. And it probably took place early. It probably took place in the 7th century. So actually before basically all of the Old English texts that we have, or almost all of them. And it affects both short vowels and long vowels. So all vowels of the relevant kind, all front vowels are affected by this sound change. It's especially associated with the South, the West Saxon dialect. And as we will see next time, the West Saxon dialect is the biggest dialect. It's the dialect that we have the most material from. Why? Because the West Saxon dialect was written in Wessex, and the king of Wessex in the 9th century was King Alfred, and he was the person who got the ball rolling with the writing of the Old English language in the first place. So that's breaking. It affects front vowels and it turns them into diphthongs. Our final change is a change that actually has two names. One of them is a German name, or a quasi-German name, I umlaut, also known as fronting. And this causes back vowels or low vowels to become fronted if they're followed by an E. Specifically, if there is a following syllable that contains an E or a Y glide, then you get fronting of these back or low vowels. So we've just seen a change that affects only the front vowels. This is a change that affects only the back vowels and turns them into front vowels. So we get oo being turned into u. So this is a high back vowel turning into a high front vowel. Oo becoming u. And this is relevant in cases like the word for mouse, because mouse was originally, in Germanic it would have been mus, and in the plural it would have had an E on the end, so musi. And this E, it sounds a bit like Swiss, doesn't it? In the plural, this E triggered fronting, triggered I umlaut. You'll also see this called I mutation sometimes. And that causes the word to become, rather than musi, it is musi. So you'd have this alternation, and then what happens later in the language is that the I disappears. So then the only alternation is singular mus, plural mus. And the same thing happens with other vowels. So the Old English for a goose was gos. The plural would have been gosi. And that turned into gesi. It moves forward in the mouth. The O turns into, O is a mid-vowel. It goes forward in the mouth and turns into an A. So then you get gos versus gesi, singular plural, which then turns into gos versus geese. Goose versus geese. And of course, in the modern language, this sounds completely different because of the great vowel shift. But that's about 1,500 years, that's about 1,000 years after all of this, right? So don't worry about the great vowel shift for now. Gos versus geese is what you have to, gos versus geese is what you have to think about now. This is also true in some kind of alternations. So fall versus fell is also a case of I umlaut. We've got an A turning into an E, turning into the ash sound, the sound represented by an ash. Again, if there was an I or a Y in the following syllable. In this example, we have a derivational alternation. This is something that we see quite often. So in the second bullet point, you see examples like drank versus drench, blood versus bleed, whole versus heal. These are all pairs of related words where the second member of the pair has been affected by fronting or I mutation. And it particularly often affects causative verbs because causative verbs in Germanic, in Proto-Germanic, were formed with a suffix yan, with a y in it. And this y suffix is what triggers the I umlaut before it is lost. So to bleed someone is to make blood come out of them, right? To drench someone is to cover them in drank, right? It's to cover them in some sort of liquid. To heal someone is to make someone whole. So that's how these words are related. They're causative verbs, verbs of making. And there are many other examples too. Man, men, long, length, food, feed. A lot of these pairs in the English language where one form has a back vowel and one form has a front vowel are related by fronting, by I umlaut. Now this is a very early change. What's very interesting is that many languages, in fact pretty much all of the Northwest Germanic languages, do undergo I umlaut, do undergo fronting, but the conditions are subtly different. So it ends up working out a little bit different in the different languages. That's why you end up with slightly different pairs here. So Maus, Mäuse, Gans, Gänse. The origin of these is the same. It's the same process. Back vowels becoming front and rounded when there is an I in the following syllable in the proto-language. Now this I is sneaky, as I said, because usually after it has triggered I mutation, after it has triggered I umlaut, it then disappears. So this is a kind of hit and run vowel. All right, so those are our three sound changes. Here is a slide where you can see some of the effects of these sound changes. So here we're back to Caedmon's hymn. And you can see some of the things that I've been telling you about earlier on. First of all, we've got this word nu at the beginning. This means now. In fact, it is the word now, but it's pronounced nu with a back oo. And it's pronounced like that because we haven't had the great vowel shift yet, remember. So these vowels are mostly long and not diphthongized, and it's much easier to relate them to their counterparts in other languages such as German in the Old English period. In fact, a relatively good rule of thumb when you're looking at Old English is to think of it as being more like German than it is like present-day English. And that is not too far from the truth, as we will especially see next week when we start dealing with the syntax of the language. On the second half of the line, you can see this f. It's written as a f, but it will be pronounced as a v. Why? Because it's between voiced sounds. So it's between voiced sounds, and that means that it gets pronounced itself as a voiced sound. The voiced fricative is an allophone of the fricative phoneme in Old English. We also see breaking in the word, in several words here. We've got eorthan. So this eorth is the word for earth. So this starts out as something like erde, and it turns into eorthan. There's the following word as well, bearnum. We've got the EA, they're followed by this R. Remember, these R's and these L's are the sounds that trigger breaking. And so barnum has turned into bearnum. And this barn is a dialectal word for children. And this is something you still find if, for instance, you end up doing any Scottish literature, for instance, with Professor Mergenthal, you might find the word bairn, B-A-I-R-N, which is a Scots word for a child. And that's the same word we find here, barn. So what this means, earthan bairnum, is children of the earth. In other words, it's referring to humans, human beings. Another thing that you'll notice about this text, this isn't related directly to the sound changes that have happened in the language, but it's cool nonetheless, is that there is alliteration. So in each line, you will see at least 2 or 3 stressed words that begin with the same sound. So in the first line, we've got Herian, Heavenreach. Heavenreach, the first part is heaven, the second part is Reich, German Reich. So this is Heavenreich, like Himmelreich, or Heaven Kingdom. The second line, we've got some M's. We've got Methodus Michte and his Modathonk. So we've got all these M's. In the third line, we've got some W's. Werk Wulderfader Swahe Wundra. Again, werk, this is the word for work. Wulderfader, Wulder is a special word. This Wulderfader means something like Wonder Father, Glory Father. And like many of these words in the poetry, it refers to God. I won't give you the full story, but the Old English poetry is basically set up around this alliterative structure. You don't have rhyme in Old English poetry. You don't have the ends of the word sounding the same. You have the beginning of the word sounding the same. And that is in all likelihood due to an important fact about Germanic stress, which is that the stress was at the beginning of the word in this period, which meant that the words lent themselves much more readily to alliterative poetry, where the beginning of the word is what sounds the same, than to rhyming poetry, where the end of the word is what sounds the same. And this kind of Germanic alliterative verse is not something that we only find in Old English. We also find it in Old High German, Old Saxon, and in Old Norse in Scandinavia. So there's a rich trove of alliterative poetry for anyone who wants to go digging into such things. If you don't want to go digging into such things, then just make sure that you learn about palatalization, breaking, and fronting for the exam. Are there any questions? Yes. The question is there any reason why breaking happened? Right? Why did breaking happen? I don't think anyone has a clue, to be honest. It happens in Old English, but it doesn't happen in the other Germanic languages. It seems to be the case that especially the r sound is produced relatively far back in the mouth in Old English, and the sounds affected by breaking are not always produced so far back. So it could be a sort of harmony process to bring the vowels closer together. But that can't be the full story. So the short answer is we don't really know. And in general, most of the sound changes that happen in the history of English, it's a heck of a lot easier to describe what happened than it is to explain why they happened. We very rarely have a good explanation for why these sound changes happened. I do teach a course in historical linguistics. I'll be teaching that next semester, or someone at least will be teaching that next semester. So if you're interested in the causes of sound changes like this, you can go to that class and find out more. But even there, I'm afraid that the explanations that you encounter may not be as satisfying as you would like. Any other questions? All right, in that case, we will move on to everyone's favourite part, Old English grammar. So as I've said before, Old English is a relatively synthetic language. That means it's got endings, it's got morphological endings. And the morphological endings that it has mostly look a bit like the German ones, or at least more like the German ones than modern English, because modern English doesn't really do endings. This is something we talked about last time when we were covering long-term grammatical change. So in Old English, we find 4 or 5 cases. We find a nominative, an accusative, a genitive, and a dative. We also find an instrumental case in some of the texts, but the instrumental case is mostly only found in very early Old English texts, and it's on its way out, so you don't really need to worry about the instrumental. But the 4 cases that you do need to worry about are the nominative, the accusative, the genitive, and the dative. And very often, nouns, adjectives, demonstratives, and personal pronouns will have different forms, different endings, depending on which case they are in. Now again, if you know your modern German grammar, this should not be a problem for you at all. If you don't know your modern German grammar, then I bet you wish that you'd listened in school. But if not, in any case, you know how to find out about it. Obviously, what I don't want you to do for this course is to memorize the morphology of the Old English language. That's pointless. What I do want you to know is how it works. I want you to understand the morphology of the Old English language, understand the principles on which it's constructed. You don't need to know every single ending. In fact, in the exam, you will have some tables of morphology provided with the exam that will enable you to look things up. The trick is that you will need to know where to look, and that is why you still need to understand the system as a whole, and why you still need to understand how to look things up, how the overall morphological system of Old English is structured. So that is what we're going to be doing in the remaining part of today's lecture, and also in the first part of next week's lecture when we come on to talking about the verbs. If you want to find out more, you can go to various different sources. So the 3 books that I've listed on this slide, Hogg and Alcorn is an introductory textbook. It's a slim little book that you can use to find out a little bit more about Old English without getting bogged down in the detail. If you're the kind of person who likes getting bogged down in detail, you can look at one of these other books, Hogg and Fulk 2011, Ringe and Taylor 2014. If you're getting baffled by some specific detail, these are the books that will contain all of the information that you will ever want, and probably a lot more besides. So here is an example of some of the grammatical features that we are going to be covering in the next 2 classes, including today. First of all, so this sentence says, then the kings Cunegils and Oswald gave to the holy Birinus the city of Dorchester as a bishop's see. Bishop's see means bishopric. It's basically the holy Birinus became a bishop. And he did that because the kings allowed him to do so. And here we see some of the similarities with German and some of the unique features of Old English as well, or special features of Old English. We'll see verb second word order. We're going to talk much more about that last week. This sentence begins, then gave the kings, and the kings is the subject of the sentence, and it comes after the verb. In modern English, it will be the other way around. Then the kings gave. But in Old English, we find very often this verb second word order. We find a plural ending. There's that as, that as plural ending. We also find Oswald the Holy. There's an error. That and at the beginning of the second line should not be an E. It should be that Tironian et symbol that you saw earlier on, the thing that looks like a 7. Doesn't really matter. It's the word and, anyway, that's the important thing. What you can see at the end of the line is tham hargan. Tham hargan. This is an example of a dative case. So we see tham, which is basically German dem. So we've got Old English tham, which behaves like German dem, dem heiligen Birinus, right? Because it's in the dative case, because he is the one who is the recipient. He is being given this thing. The adjective holy has an an ending on it, which is a weak adjective ending. Again, if you know your German grammar, you know about these guys, an en ending. So tham Heilgen here is behaving a lot like German dem Heiligen. And then again, we've got dative. We've got a special dative ending on the noun here, Bischofsstole. So this would be like something like Bischofsstuhl in German, and we have an e ending. Now this e dative ending is something that is very consistently found in Old English, and you occasionally see it in German still as well. So in something like Ich bin zu Hause, the on the end of house is an old dative ending. And this in Hause is the same that we see here on the word Bischofsstole. It's a dative, an old dative ending. And then in the final line we see an accusative, the Burg, and this word Burg is related to German Burg, but it means city rather than castle. So the Burg Dorchester. That's a sort of whistle-stop tour of various different morphological features. I'm going to rewind it a bit and go a little bit more slowly now over some of these features and how they work. So these are the nominal morphology features of Old English. The first thing, and probably the biggest and most horrible table that you will encounter today at least, is the personal pronouns. But actually when you start looking at these personal pronouns, they're not really as scary as they look, because most of them really just look like modern English. So for instance, in the first person accusative, we've got me, dative me, genitive mean, me, mine, right? We also find some forms that look a bit more like German. So in the first person singular nominative, we have ich, right, which looks a heck of a lot like ich. And in the accusative, we find me, but we also find mech, which is a lot like mich, okay? Similarly, in the second person singular, this second person singular ought to straight away remind you of something that you see in German. We've got thu, we've got fetch, we've got thine. These forms are like du, dich, dein, right? They're a second person singular form. And we will see as the course goes on, a lot of interesting things happen to the second person pronouns in English. They undergo quite a lot of change. And they're quite fun because in the Middle English period and the early modern period, they start behaving in really strange ways. But I won't get ahead of myself now. Regardless, what you need to note is that there is this thu, and the related forms that are related to the du forms in German. Third person singular, pretty straightforward, at least as far as the masculine is concerned. He, hin, him, his. Not much that will put you off when you're reading the texts here. The feminine looks weird because the nominative and accusative are not she and her, but rather heo and here. So they're pronounced with an initial H. So that is different, and that's something that you will need to look out for. The difference between he, masculine, and heo, feminine, is quite subtle in this language. And then, of course, you've got the neuter, you've got the third person singular neuter, which is, in Old English, hit, with a h on the front of it, which later develops into it. Now, when it comes to the plural, again, shouldn't look too difficult. We've got we, us, ure, which is just our, right, O-U-R in modern English. The third person plural, again, looks weird. It's got H's where you might expect a TH. We'll get to the explanation of that, but not today. And in the middle of the table, you've got these rows that are in a slightly lighter shade of blue. I don't know if that even comes out on this screen, but it ought to. The dual. We've got a first-person dual and a second-person dual. And these dual forms are used when you are referring to precisely two people. So wit means we two or us two. Two people inclusive. Similarly, yit refers to you two. This seems to be a very useful distinction to make, and I don't really know why the English language ended up getting rid of it. But the fact remains that it did, and it did so very, very early. So like the instrumental case, the dual number is very, very rare in the early texts. We don't see an awful lot of it. And in later Old English, we don't see it at all. Alfred basically never uses it. So the dual forms wit, unk, unker, and yit, ink, inker are not forms that you will encounter very frequently in reading Old English texts. One thing to note here is that Old English doesn't have reflexive pronouns. Old English only has normal pronouns. So something like he washed himself in Old English would be he washed him. And the two pronouns simply refer to the same person in Old English. It's the same as a bit like in German, you might say something like, ich wasche mich, and this mich is me, it's not myself, it's just the normal first-person pronoun. So Old English pronouns there isn't a special reflexive form with self. You just use the normal pronoun to form reflexives. So here's two examples. We've got in the first case, this is an example from Beowulf. Thathech drichtguma death over swedeth, that you, mighty ruler, death overpowers. And here we can see this thech form of the pronoun, which remember is like dich. It is a singular second person form. In the second one here, in the second example on this side, we've got tha behuda Adam hin, and this means then Adam hid himself. And here you can see that the normal pronoun, the normal accusative pronoun hinne, which is a bit like German ihn, I-H-N, it's behaving like a reflexive pronoun. And this is what we always find in Old English. We never find normal pronouns. We never find reflexive pronouns, sorry. We just find normal pronouns basically doing double duty. They can be normal pronouns or they can be reflexive pronouns, and you have to figure out their interpretation from the context. The other thing about Old English, as I said before, is that because this is not a standardized language, there is a lot of spelling variation. Doesn't mean that anything goes, but there is usually more than one way of spelling a given word. You'll find different variants. Okay, here we've got another little paradigm. This is a paradigm for demonstratives. And demonstratives are very useful if you're trying to understand an Old English text, because what demonstratives do is they allow you to distinguish the case of the phrase, because demonstratives are very richly marked for case. Now, if you look at these, the basic structure of this paradigm is very, very much like the definite article in German. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. So particularly if we look at the genitive, what we see in the genitive is thas in the masculine and the neuter, thara in the feminine, and thara in the plural. So this is like des and der, for those of you who still know what the genitive is. R.I.P., our beloved genitive case. If it's any consolation to you, Old English, or English is a lot further down that road, at least than German is. You also have in the dative this form tham, which, as I said before, is like dem. So the endings here look like the endings on the German definite article, and this is quite a striking property. So dem in the masculine and the neuter, der in the feminine. In the nominative and accusative, things look a little bit more confusing, but some of the endings you can still recognize. So thonne in the masculine is a bit like den in German. Den Hund habe ich gesehen. And then we have that in the neuter. We have a tha form that crops up in the feminine and in the plural. And we have a se and a seo in the masculine and feminine. So we've got a few different forms here. This is a complicated paradigm. It's also a very useful paradigm because these definite articles or demonstratives come up a lot. I've called them demonstratives on this slide, but as you can see here at the bottom, these demonstratives actually are also definite articles, and you find them in most of the places where you would expect a definite article the in modern English, or a der, die, das in modern German. It's more or less, by the Old English period, doing the same thing. So these demonstratives are useful to know about. And if you do decide to memorize any paradigms, this is the one I would recommend. It's the only one that's probably worth learning off by heart, for you guys at least. Here we've got some nouns. The nouns, now nouns in Old English, just like in German, have grammatical gender. This should come as no surprise, having seen the paradigm back there. You've got masculine, feminine, and neuter, just like you do in German. And so you've got masculine nouns like Bad, meaning boat, neuter nouns like ship, meaning ship. You've got feminine nouns like Shinu, meaning shine, etc. And the paradigms I've given you here are the strong nouns. And what you'll see here is that the strong nouns, a lot of the time, endings are not that distinct. The nominative and the accusative are very rarely distinguished in nouns in Old English, just as they are basically never distinguished in German today. So the dative has this on the end in the singular. If you want to generalize about this column here, the dative column, what you can say is a dative will have an on the end in the singular, and it will have an on the end in the plural. So you've got an in the dative singular and in the dative plural. Then in the masculine and neuter, you've got this genitive s in the singular. And in the plural, you've always got just an a for the genitive plural. Bata, meaning of the boats. Shipa, meaning of the ships. Shina, meaning of the shines, whatever that means. If you ever wanted to put shine in the genitive plural, now you know how to do it. So these are the strong nouns, and these are also called A stem, U stem, and O stem nouns, respectively. Not for any particularly useful reason, but you will sometimes see that in older textbooks. So these are strong nouns, and there are also weak nouns that you can look at in the textbook if you want to. Weak nouns are kind of boring. Most of the time they end in N, and this really illustrates one very, very important point about Old English, because although Old English is more synthetic than modern English, the actual number of distinct endings on Old English, for instance, Old English nouns, is very, very low. So actually, this is not a language that makes huge numbers of distinctions in its nominal paradigms. Here, for instance, you can see in the feminine singular here, we've got shinu in the nominative, and then shine in the accusative, dative, and genitive. So this type of noun doesn't make a distinction between the accusative, the dative, and the genitive. So although Old English is a synthetic language, it is not the most synthetic language you will find. There are many, many languages out there that are way, way, way more synthetic than Old English. And those include Turkish, for instance, and many of the languages, the indigenous languages of North America. But all of the nouns have the same basic paradigm structure. You can always draw a little table with nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive, with masculine, neuter, and feminine, and with singular and plural. Those are the crucial features that you need to know about in order to figure out what a noun is, how it works in a given text. Here are the adjectives. Again, I've showed you the strong adjective endings. There are also weak adjective endings, but they're mostly N. And the adjective endings, one thing that you will see straight away is that they actually look quite a lot like the noun endings. And that is because in Indo-European, in Proto-Indo-European, there wasn't a separate class of adjectives. Adjectives were just nouns that were sort of stuck together with other nouns. In Old English also, adjectives are not all that clear-cut as a separate word class. You see, some of the endings are the same. For instance, the dative plural ending is the same ending that you found in dative plural nouns. The s ending in the genitive singular is the same s ending that you find in the masculine and neuter singular of nouns. So many of the adjective endings are the same as the noun endings, which means that you can save time if you're trying to look these things up, because you can associate certain endings with certain morphological features regardless of what kind of word they occur on, like this and this s, which signal dative plural and genitive singular respectively. Broadly speaking, what determines the distribution of strong and weak adjectives in Old English is what determines the distribution of strong and weak adjectives in modern German. That is, if you've got some kind of a definite article or demonstrative or quantifier in front of the adjective, then you have a weak ending. And if you have no demonstrative or quantifier or something like that in front of the noun, then you get the strong ending. And in the context of adjectives, basically strong means that it can stand on its own without any help from a demonstrative or a determiner, and weak means that it's leaning on a determiner or a quantifier or something like that. Adjectives also have comparatives and superlatives, which behave in just the same way as they do in modern English. So for the adjective hard, meaning hard, you've got herdra, harder, and herdost, hardest. And these endings are used regardless of how long the adjective is. So again, this is fairly similar to what we see in German today. You will get really bored of me saying that over the next lecture and a half. Well, lecture and a bit. Okay, so here's some examples of adjectives, and these come from the works of Alfred. I've just given you a few selected ones so that you can get a taste for how this system works. In the different Alfred stories, I've pulled out some different adjective endings, determiners, and that kind of thing. I've given you here all of the information that you'll need. These are glosses underneath all of them. So if you take the first one, for instance, von a Heiligen Geist, this would be den Heiligen Geist, right? It's the Holy Ghost. This is something. This hopefully you can see a few different things here. First of all, you can see this unambiguously accusative masculine demonstrative form, and then you see a weak ending on the adjective, which is just an N, and then you've got this strong noun, but remember the strong nouns mostly don't have endings in the nominative and accusative singular, so this word gast, ghost, just doesn't have an ending, just like in the modern language. Second example here, Sadevoliche water, the devilish water, literally, the devilish liquid. One thing you can see there is that there is a win rune. This wata word has this win rune at the beginning of it, which remember is pronounced w. It's a W. So this is wata. And so you can see a masculine nominative determiner, se. Then you can see the adjective with a weak ending again, because there's a demonstrative there. And then you can see the noun water or liquid. In the next example, we've got young man. And this is a strong ending. It actually doesn't have an ending. But the fact that it doesn't have an ending shows that it is strong in this case. So young man, probably not too difficult for you to read this either if you're an English speaker or a German speaker. Young man is just about manageable. In fact, if like me, you grow up in North Derbyshire, you get lots of people, if you do something naughty, a teacher will come to you and say, young man. This is hopefully fairly easy to understand. And in the final example, mid, so this is like mit, the preposition mit in German means with. Mid, sodum, true, belief, yelevan. So the true here has the ending because it has a strong dative ending. So that's this dative, this strong dative here. If you need extra resources for Old English morphology, there are plenty around. The Bosworth and Toller dictionary is great for looking things up. You can type in a word and search for it using this dictionary. So it's very easy to use. You can either type in a modern English word or an Old English word, and you'll get the results either way. If you want Beowulf, you can get Beowulf. There is Beowulf, and Beowulf comes with a translation on this website. And if you just want to look at the morphology, if you just want an overview of all of the morphology of English, then you'll be pleased to see that all of the morphology of Old English fits onto a single sheet of paper, a single A4 sheet of paper. And it's nicely color-coded so that you can see some of the similarities between the different endings. It looks a bit like this beautiful periodic table that we have on the right-hand wall here, with colors to help you navigate. Finally then, before we wrap up, first of all, does anyone have any questions or comments at this point? The morphology of Old English can sometimes seem pretty dry, but it is the thing that is the most difficult when you're reading the texts, so it's worth putting in the time to understand how the system works so that you know how to look words up. In terms of the function of the cases, like I say, you're German speakers, so you all intuitively know this, even if you don't know it explicitly, but the cases basically work the same way. So a nominative case is found on the subject of a clause. If you say something like, in a sense, like I gave him John's book, I would be the nominative constituent here because I is the subject. Old English, if you know any Latin or even any Sanskrit, then where those languages use a vocative, Old English uses a nominative. If you don't know any Latin or Sanskrit, you can forget about what I just said. The accusative is found on the direct object. So the accusative, again, is a very commonly found case. Something like John's book as a whole would be marked as the accusative here because this is the direct object of the clause. And it's also used, the accusative is also used on the complement of certain prepositions, just like it is in German. The dative then is used for indirect objects, and indirect objects are typically things like recipients, though the dative case does have a slightly broader distribution in Old English. So you also, just like in German, you can have sentences like mir ist kalt, I am cold, but with a dative pronoun. This kind of dative of a psychological predicate, a dative of feeling, is also something that we find in Old English. So in a sentence like, I gave him John's book, him would be in the dative case in Old English. And we also find it on the complement of certain prepositions like location. In general, it's tricky to know which preposition belongs with which case. And if you're not sure, the best way is to look these things up. The genitive is probably the easiest case to understand because the genitive is simply on possessors. There are a few other uses, but the main use of the genitive is for possessives. So I gave him John's book. John's, the possessive, would be in the genitive case in Old English. So the genitive case in Old English is like the German genitive case, except that Old English speakers actually use it. And, as I've said, and I will say again, this system looks a lot like German. So use your native speaker knowledge, use even your intuition if you need to navigate this system. And if you've forgotten your basic German school grammar, then it might not be a bad time to brush up on it. Okay, here is a little example of some case-marked sentences. So here we've got a sentence from the voyage of Othera, who was a Northman. He's referred to as a Northman, which presumably means that he comes from Scandinavia. But he was friends with King Alfred, and he went around travelling and then reported back to Alfred. So he said to his Lord Alfred the King, and here his Lord Alfred the King is in the dative case because it's the recipient of the information, so it's dative. You can check the endings. And then we've got, of all the Northmen, era Northmonna. So this is a genitive, it's a possessor. So he lived the northmost of all of the Northmen. Then we've got he, the subject, and that's in the nominative case. And we've got a couple of prepositional complements, one of which is in the dative and one of which is in the accusative. Because on is a preposition of location, so it takes the dative, and with, which doesn't mean with in Old English, it means along or against, is a preposition essentially of motion, so it takes the accusative case. Along the West Sea, with the West Sea. Okay, I will let you read this summary slide in your own time. You have some work to do for your tutorial this week. There's a couple of short exercises for you to do on pages 81 and 82 of the textbook, and I also would like you to look at the Old English Genesis text, text 1, on Ilias, before you attend the tutorial. Next time I will see you again, and we'll finish off Old English.